All right, the interactive portion is done. You don't have to talk to me anymore. My name is Bryan Mahoney. I am an author myself, having written a book of poetry over there with my typewriter, or I should say typewriters, a few of them. It's a long way off from where I started my career as a journalist, and my last job in journalism was with the LA Times as an editor. And I today write a lot of different copy for, well, both freelance and for a very small company called Kaiser Permanente. So, welcome and thank you for joining us all, and thanks for joining all of my friends here. Scott doesn't know this, but he needs to sit down soon because I'm going to introduce him. So I'm just going to kill time by saying, saying a few words about our discussion today. So we're going to talk about character development, and these authors all have a very diverse range of background. You're gonna find out in a second here. And this is going to be a great discussion because I think you'll see every author approaches character development very differently. And that really holds true for the whole writing process. How many of you would say that you're writers? Okay, how many of you just enjoy writing? Oh, that's funny. Okay, so most of us don't enjoy writing, but we call ourselves writers. You are definitely writers. So character development, super important, right? Antagonist, protagonist, and everybody else in between. And we're going to get into a little bit about not only how those are made, but why they are made. I think that's a really important component of this. So I'm going to start with the far end there. We're going to start with Scott Coon. Scott is a published novelist, an award-winning short story writer, and a former U.S. Army intelligence analyst. His science fiction, his afterlife fiction called Godless Armageddon is over there in the corner, and it was recently #1 on the hot new releases in atheist books on Amazon. We next have, yes, a smattering of applause for Scott. We have Anne Louise Bannon. Her husband says that his wife kills people for a living. Okay, Anne mostly writes mysteries.
He does not live in fear.
Yes, okay.
Any comments he makes about living in fear for his life is total BS. If he was that scared, he wouldn't do as much as he does to piss me off.
I love it. Anne has written the old Los Angeles series, the Freddie and Kathy series, and the Operation Quickline series. She has worked as a freelance journalist for magazines and newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times. Next, we have Janet Wertman. Her critically acclaimed character-driven historical novels reflect a passion for the Tudor area. And she's harbored this since she was 8 years old. Janet also runs a blog and a YouTube channel where she posts interesting takes on the Tudors and what it's like to write about them. If you couldn't tell, just take a look at her book covers and you'll see. Marcy Mahoney, next, is the author of the fantasy novel Archwild and the Words of series of creative writing prompt books, and several short stories published in various fiction anthologies. Her writing is magical and spooky with a hint of the funny. She loves coffee but not caffeine, cake, cats, cardigans, and undermining the patriarchy. She also has the best looking book covers because I designed them. Okay, next week. Sorry, I had to get that in there. Next is Vance. Vance Gloster is an award-winning writer who has a career as a computer scientist working on the space shuttle program and in AI before turning to writing full-time. His sci-fi cyber thriller, 2/3 of a God, which you'll see over there, was published in March. He's also a musician, having appeared on several albums. Gerry Gainford is a nerd. Sorry, Gerry, that's all it says here. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Gerry Gainford is a nerd who spends the workday talking about computer security and likes to spend his free time cursing blank pages. I think you have a lot of fellow page cursors in this room. His first novel, After the Fall, is out now. And last but not least, we have Rie Lee, a recovering true believer whose debut novel, Vessel, recently won a 2025 Literary Global Children's Book Award. She's a little too obsessed with cults and almost definitely is on some kind of FBI watch list for researching pipe bombs. We will have a Q&A at the end if you would like any more information from me. Okay, I'm going to sit down for the Q&A, but I'm going to do a little bit of a round robin here. And like I said, at the end, we're going to ask our authors some questions, so feel free to kind of jot them down or hold them until the end. And the first question here, I talked a little bit about this in the beginning. We're talking about heroes and protagonists and what makes them distinct, and why are they the lead in your story? So I'm just going to go all the way down to the end. Start with Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Green, as you know. In my book, God's Armageddon, which you see on display over here, the main character is Thomas Jefferson Stone Shield VII, and a lot of his story is actually carried in that name because he dies storming the beaches of D-Day in World War II without leaving an heir. So there's not going to be the 8th, and that weighs heavily upon him. And he's also from a long line of soldiers where every soldier in his family has fought for America in every war. So everybody in his fraternal line has fought wars going back to the 1200s back in England. So he's a very military person and a very military family. And right next to him is a Jewish boy who was smuggled out of Germany barely in time for him to turn around and come back and be on the same boat as Tom. And the reason why Tom is the main character and is not David or any of the other people is because Tom is the tactician who is going to figure this out. Now, why didn't anybody else figure out how to fight this war in the afterlife and save all of humanity from the soul wells? They tried, they did, and they built up everything, and this guy comes along and he takes it to the next level. And why wasn't it David? Because David wasn't focused on what the plot of the story was. The plot of the story was, we're going to save the afterlife for all humanity, and possibly the afterlives of alien species as well. So the person that was going to do that would be Tom. So that's why he's the main character.
Cool. Gerry, I'm going to go to you, same question. Why is the main character the main character?
Healy, in post-apocalyptic zombie, mine is not zombie, but any of those, there's a very standard, there's a guy, he's going to go on a journey and he's going to fight a lot of people, there's a lot of desperate people, he's going to fight them. And I suddenly realized that my main character is a woman, it became very, very different, because unless she's some kind of kung fu expert, she's not going to fight them all. And I've got an engineering background, computer engineering, so I made my character an electronic engineer, so I've got a female MacGyver who's going to think her way through the apocalypse. So Haley wants to travel along, and she can't really fight gangs with guns. There's not going to be all those big explosions the way we'd expect. She's got to think her way through it and solve it with a Swiss Army knife and a piece of chewing gum the way MacGyver would. And I thought that made it different. And it gave me much more opportunities, because when she meets the gangs, they're not automatically going to want to just kill them the way you're going to kill Mad Max or the guy in The Walking Dead or any of that. It's a woman. I can just take whatever I want from her. I've got a big gun. Or I can take her. Hey, I'm a nice guy. I'm being nice to you. I'm giving you an opportunity. You should be grateful. So there's all these other ways to do it, and she has to think her way out of it. And that I thought made the story interesting, and that's why she's the lead.
And Janet, we're going to pivot to historical fiction.
Yeah, my answers are going to be different pretty much all the way through. Biographical fiction goes in the opposite direction. I'm given a character. Now, admittedly, I get to choose who that character is. There are a lot of historical figures. I chose Elizabeth Tudor, considered one of England's greatest monarchs. The book, this book, the first in the series, is the story of how she went from Henry VIII's bastardized daughter, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's bastardized daughter. Anne Boleyn was the wife he executed on fake charges of adultery, and somehow she still ended up taking the English throne. So there you go. You've got a pretty distinct situation right there, and that's the external piece. The real story is in the internal piece, and how she There were a lot of deadly situations that were thrown at her, and she was able to overcome them, defeat them with courage, wisdom, and judgment. And these were things that she developed over the course of the book. It was an amazing story to tell. It's nowhere near done. That's why books 2 and 3 will actually cover her reign and explain how she became one of England's greatest monarchs. So there we go.
Cool. And right next to you is Anne. And you probably have the highest volume of books of anyone on the panel here. So, probably a lot of main characters for you, right?
Well, yeah, actually I have quite a few, and basically they talk to me. That's basically how a story starts with me. So how do they become the leads is they just keep talking to me. Maddie Wilcox, just, she's the old Los Angeles series, and Sid and Lisa, who are currently talking to me because I'm working on that series right now. And that happened years ago, and just wouldn't let me go. And the story originally started with Lisa. It was her story. It was her angst that was driving not so much the plot, but her need to write it out. And then Sid started coming, and he wouldn't shut up. And then there was, in I think book 7, there's a significant chunk of the story where Lisa's not there, so all of a sudden Sid takes over as the narrator. And it's just people talk to me. It's noisy up here. I don't know what else to say.
I love that answer. I know we all probably have these voices in our heads. Vance, I'm just looking at your book, thinking 2/3 of a god here. I mean, what brings out the main character for you?
Eleanor, my main character, is a high flyer. She leads the development team that's doing the next generation of the internet, which is satellite-based. But it's like many jobs in technology, it's one of those jobs that takes over your life and essentially eats it. So over the 5 years while they've been developing this, her husband has divorced her, her 17-year-old daughter has become estranged from her. And at the beginning of the book, she has been diagnosed with a fatal disease. So she had always thought when she came to the end of the project, she could fix her relationships and have a life. Well, that's not going to happen. She gets a second chance when she becomes a virtual human. Her brain is scanned into a computer, so she can go ahead and move on from there. Part of what the book is about is she, even though being a high flyer, has always just been a support role. She's never kind of had agency herself to create her own world. And so over the course of the book, as she goes up against the antagonist, she actually finds her power and goes ahead and acquires agency. I found that a compelling story.
That's great. Rie, I'm going to jump to you next. Main character energy.
Yeah, I like that you ended on the concept of agency. So my protagonist of this particular book, Vessel, is Paige, who is a 16 going on 17-year-old girl in post-apocalyptic Central California, which is, in case you haven't guessed, where I grew up. When I first started writing this book, it was, I want to say 2011, and I was really obsessed with the idea of human sacrifice, and I think a big part of that was because of Joan of Arc. And there's this Mario's Time Machine computer game that you could get from Costco in the 90s that had a sub-game on it called Library, and it was Bowser's mom, and she was the librarian. And in this game, there was this story of Joan of Arc, and it was illustrated, and they've got this iconic piece of art that I found many years later, and I forget what it's called, but it's an image of Joan of Arc just sort of standing there, being burned at the stake as she's got this crucifix before her eyes. And there's something about that image that just never really let me go. And so I wasn't trying to like copy Joan of Arc, but something about that I think just led me to talking about like, you know, what would it be like if you had somebody who was like volunteering to be a human sacrifice? You know, like that's the thing that does happen. And if you look at like Mesoamerican history, specifically with the Aztec and the Maya, the history of people volunteering to be human sacrifices is really alarming. Granted, there were plenty of people who were voluntold and did not enjoy that. But for the ones who did volunteer, there's a sort of sense of, like in the Hunger Games, there are those people who did grow up wanting to be the people for the glory and the honor. In this particular case, Paige is not necessarily a particularly, she's doing it out of desperation. This book used to have a male deuteragonist. Now that character is female, and part of that was because of the own sort of like, over the years I've massaged the story quite a lot. And then it sort of came out of, well, the reason that people look for human sacrifice is the concept of belief. They really, really believe in what they're looking into. And I started processing my own concept of religious deconstruction, so over time, that I also was coming out at the same time, so those two things melded together, and now it's a whole story at the end. I'm done.
So it's kind of, you took the broader view and you kind of refined, and then at the end, there's your main character.
Yeah, in and then out and then in.
Yeah, that's cool. Marcy.
Main character energy.
Main character energy. So my book, I wrote the first draft in purple pen in notebooks in like study hall in high school back in the 90s. And it sat on a shelf for years, and then I pulled it out again in my 40s and was like, I should write this better. So I did, or I tried to anyway. My Archworld is a coming-of-age sword and sorcery book, so fantasy story. So of course, my main character, Julia, is the long-lost heir to the throne, as you would have in a coming-of-age sword and sorcery story, with unbeknownst magic powers. So pretty standard, you know, fantasy hero fare. But I think what makes her different is her genuine empathy and open-mindedness to change. A lot of times, the hero gets called onto the hero's quest, and they adamantly resist it. Julia certainly has reluctance, but her empathy and her strong inclination to help others helps her to be open to what's coming her way, even if it's hard or terrifying. I think she's just open and brave, but also like real and human. So that's what I tried to write.
All right, now we're going to flip to the other side. So, when you're crafting a villain, how many of us have heard the phrase that the villain is the hero of their own story? You ever heard that before? That's writing advice I've heard for years, right? You want to make sure that the
relatable villain is someone who believes that they're right by whatever code it is that they're living by.
So Gerry, I'm going to go to you first. Can you talk about your villain and then also maybe why they're not the hero of your story?
Zeke's the main villain in my story, and he wouldn't be, because he's just bitter. He was due to inherit everything. His father was a multi-millionaire. He was about to graduate med school and the world ended. And god damn it, he deserved all these good things. He deserved the super yachts. He deserved everything, and he didn't get it. And he's bitter. So he would not be the hero of his own story. He thinks he deserves it, and he should be. This is his due. But the other villains in my story really are. The patron, and people say, oh, I was born in the wrong century. He was just born in the wrong political era. He needed the end of the world. He's the true American dream. Small-time drug dealer who rises to lead what's left of the US. And then Ted, who is the leader of gangs, motorcycle gangs who just kill for the fun of it. He's the hero of the story because he's a prophet. He is fully a prophet of the new order. If the world's ended and God has deserted us, he's the new prophet that tells us what's coming next.
So it sounds like the two things to survive the apocalypse are cockroaches and capitalism? Is that?
Sorry?
Cockroaches and capitalism?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. All right, so Marcy, Marcy's my wife. Maybe I should set that in context. I know
her book very well. But I don't want to answer this question, because I have my own opinions about your villain. But tell us about your villain and how he's the hero in his story.
Keep in mind, when I wrote the first draft of this, it was 1992. So right around the time Disney's Three Musketeers came out. So Cardinal Richelieu, Tim Curry, was like my favorite villain. He was the original archetype for this guy. But of course, it's been 30 plus, yeah, exactly. Hero in his own story. But it's been 30 plus years since then, and I've learned a lot more about the world and about, how to write a villain. So as Orator, he's the bad guy in my book. He's the king. He is power hungry, not just to rule the land as he sees fit, but to possess and wield magic, which he was not born with. And in the world that I write, you're born with magic. It's not something that you can study. It's inherent in your bloodstream. So he turns to the forbidden art of blood magic to get what he wants, which is basically taking life to create magic. He's the hero in his own story, because he has now attained both the throne and magic, thereby making himself the powerful king he always wanted to be. Not only does he wield blood magic himself, but he controls the powers of almost every mage in the kingdom. So if you have magical powers under his rule, you are required by law to report to his magical citadel and become one of the mages working for him. So he controls all the magic in the country, he thinks. But, he's not the hero in this kingdom by story because he is a narcissistic, sociopathic, power-hungry megalomaniac with zero empathy, and it turns out people don't like being controlled, stolen from, and murdered.
Who knew?
Right? So, yeah, that's our first.
We'll go to Rie next with this one.
I know they got sneaky over here. Thank you. There's technically an antagonist. The antagonist is the matriarch. The matriarch is the sort of leader of this post-apocalyptic cult. And she is in some ways, when you think about cult leaders, they tend to be sort of deistic. They're the sort of larger than life personality. They have to be the, what's the thing that people use to talk about cult leaders? I forget. Charismatic leader, there you go. And I think she certainly is that. But I think the real villain of the whole thing is the community itself. And I say this because when you live in a cult, and really what I should say is high control environment, because cults are not about the belief, it's about the control. So when you grow up in a high control environment, there are certain people that you rely on to validate you. And when you are shunned from that community, everything's taken from you, right? Your livelihood, your family, your community, you've got nothing left to stand on. You're just sort of wailing in space around somewhere else. When you have your sense of community, that's the thing that tethers you to your sense of self. And so what happens is that you start to feel like you don't really know who you are, because the whole point of this control environment is to control people. They want people to be cookie cutter versions of this idealized version of person. This is going to be your devout, modest, concept of what it is to be a woman. Everybody needs to be straight, and they all need to be married to one single person for their entire lives, and they don't get to choose who that person is really, but you kind of can, but not really. You all have to have children on demand at this time, but if you have a child that we don't want you to have, we're going to force you to abort it. Lots of this kind of stuff, right? All of these things happen in time and space. And so I really wanted to highlight it in this particular world, because it's not the matriarch who is the person who is making all this happen. She's just enforcing it. But the rest of the community's acceptance of this sense of control over themselves and over their neighbors is the thing that continues the misery to go forward. So I really think it's just a matter of the spell not quite being broken, and that's because even though things are broken, society still continues. And it's not until they're able to, until you know, something big happens where they can't rely on their general, you know, human sacrifice mechanism for getting to their afterlife, that you really start having to question, like, whether all of this control that they've so carefully created for themselves is really worth it.
And Vance, I'll go to you. Yes, let's talk about the villain too, but something that Rie said is kind of interesting too. You know, is there a societal component too at all? To, like, I mean, is the bad guy just a product of their upbringing and their society and their circumstances, or is there something more?
Yeah, the villain that I want to talk about is a guy named Benjamin. He starts off as an ally to to Eleanor, my main character. And they were friends from college, and he develops the technology that allows the creation of the virtual Eleanor. So they're allies in the first part of the story. Well, eventually he goes to work for the person who is the main villain. And what he really represents something I saw in technology, being a software developer, where people in technology sometimes are amoral in the sense that they don't really see morality, that it's all about the technology and moving the technology forward, and they're not evil people, but it just doesn't occur to them to think about moral concerns when they make their next decision about things. And he's kind of like this. And so I thought that was interesting. And to your point about society, I think our society today sort of rewards people who have this approach, you know, of not worrying about the moral consequences and just pushing technology forward.
That's a great answer. This next question, and I'm gonna pose it to you first. So if you have your villain and plunk them down, right?
Yeah.
Your characters now have to do something. So can you talk about relationships between your characters and how you approach that?
Well, 90% of what I write is about the relationships. It's, in particular, the book Running Away to Boston, which is a tech thriller sort of maybe, but it's mostly about people. In particular, a mother and a daughter and her long-lost mother. And you see why the two were separated in the prologue. But this girl is grown up thinking, well, sort of thinking that her mother was blown away in a tornado, and finds out, oops, maybe not. Then, you know, you get into the Quickline series, and Sid and Lisa, and Sid is this randy, this takes place in the 80s, so he could do this back then. He's this randy dude who sleeps around relentlessly, and Lisa's a very nice girl. She's still a virgin. And you get two people who shot fall in love with each other. And how does that happen? In the course of trying to be spies. I sometimes call it a spy thriller with romantic intrusions, or a romance with espionage intrusions. But it's always going to be the relationships, especially Running Away to Boston. A lot of it, which takes place in LA, by the way. Boston's a metaphor. But the idea is that it's about the relationships between the people, in particular, especially between Janny and her mother, and these other hackers that are trying to save the world. Well, yeah, saving the world's important, but how do they relate to each other? How do they talk? It's about the human story. And especially with as much technology as I have in that one, vetted by JPL engineers, so I got it right, I think. The technology changes in the blink of an eye. I'm sure Vance's story, which is probably wonderful, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, Vance, but, you know, it sounds fascinating, but, you know, let's be real, it's going to be obsolete, but they're going to invent that kind of AI thing in another 20 years, you know? We're going to have virtual human beings. So
I guess I better sell my books quick.
Yeah, I guess so. and that's not a knock on the way, but it is one of those realities when you're writing heavy technology. I mean, when I wrote about World Enough in Time, there was, you know, the time machine had a smooth surface that felt like glass, but not white. You could touch it to make it do things. And then they go and develop the touch screen. I had to rewrite it. So, you know, but again, that's another story where it's the relationships that count. You know, what gets Robin and her brother Dean into trouble is that Dean falls in love with this gal that has been brought forward from the 17th century. And all of a sudden now they can't just leave her there, you know. So that drives a lot of the plot. And that's the crux of it all. I mean, you can have an interesting plot, but if the relationships aren't there, why bother? Okay, Vance, your turn.
I have to say, first of all, my book is not just about the technology, it's also about the relationships. We have this relationship with the antagonist, which I think some people, when they start reading it, think that there's going to be a romance between them. And that doesn't happen in the book. But there are relationships after she becomes a virtual human. There's an arisen AI, an AI that didn't used to be a human, that acts as kind of a mentor and sounding board for her, that they talk together. And Benjamin, the antagonist, also creates a second version of her that from the same scan. So there are two virtual humans created from the same scan, but they have very different experiences. The second one, called Ellen X, goes through some fairly horrific things at Benjamin's hands. And so we see the relationship between someone who is damaged and someone who is less damaged from the whole, but starting as the same person. And I thought that was an interesting relationship to explore.
And I think we'll go to Rie next. Same question.
That's really fascinating, Vance, because I feel like that question of like who's doing the harming is a very good question for you know, like thinking about writing books. Somebody once told me that I feel like books are the story of decay or something like that. And you're just sort of like watching this thing break apart. And part of that happens because humans hurt one another, right? Like that's something that we do. And there's obviously no story unless you've got somebody who's going through some sort of like monumental, you know, experience or whatever. But in Vessel in particular, there's a couple of main relationships. So this character is a true believer, right? She's a ride or die. She's going to be like doing this thing. She's going to be giving herself up to this religion until she dies. That's her plan. But then there are two people who can change that in her world. One of whom is her brother, and the other of whom is her best friend. Her brother, they both like grow up in this sort of chaotic home. They have these parents who fight all the time, and they sort of have their own little, island, but like maybe a peninsula, who knows. They have their own sort of sense of existing. They have this shared trauma that they're able to sort of handle. But as they get older, she deals with it differently than he does. She more so disassociates, he leans into it. And now that they're sort of at this breaking point, she's called to be this human sacrifice. It's the things that he does to respond to that end up being the thing that push Paige away from what she normally would have done. And I think ultimately, like when it comes down to me as a person, me as a reader, me as a writer, like I like to think of myself as a pacifist. But honestly, like you hurt my people and I will cut you. Not literally, with words. a very strongly worded letter. But you know, like this is my joking face. It's the same as my regular face, so it's very difficult to tell. But the romance character, the best friend character, is the other thing, right? So this is the best friend. They've lived together since they were young, right across the hall. You know, they grew up together. There's nowhere else to really go in this community. It's this post Soviet Union bombs, dropping the atomic bombs. There you go. You know, like this post like nuclear environment. They've clung to this religion because the narrative is that that's what has kept them alive since then. That's what's rebuilt their society and human existence and all that other good stuff. But you know, in reality, kids are still kids. They grow up and they grow up next to each other, and they've created these little spaces of safety for one another. And so Paige does that with her brother Saul. She does that with her best friend Maud. But Maud is super flaming gay. Like she's just like, you know, I don't really care. Just like do whatever, but just don't hurt Paige. You know, Paige gets hurt. Maud does not like that. Maud pushes back real hard. And then that sort of like forces Paige to confront all the things that she's been willing to accept. And so I really feel like the role of an antagonist, or not as an antagonist, but as the sort of like, the relationships that are so vulnerable in our protagonists' lives, those are the things that evoke the most impulse for our protagonist to take that step of courage into a space that they're not used to. And it really draws them into the next phase of their life that really propels the story.
And speaking of, Janet, I know I'm looking at you. Just thinking, like, in terms of what you write, I'm sure relationships that's everything, right?
It really was. There was no way that 14-year-old Elizabeth could have done everything that she did if she did not have people that she trusted around her. She, in terms of like that good news, bad news, because early on she was persona non grata, her father really marginalized her. Anyone who was nice to her when she was really young was truly a friend. And those relationships stuck with her all her life, because once she made it to the throne, she rewarded those friendships. And she was on the throne for decades. But if you squinted, you would see the same people surrounding her at the start and at the end. It was not just those people, it was their sons and daughters. It was their grandsons and granddaughters. She trusted and kept those people around. So it was really a huge responsibility to make sure that I told the origin story of those relationships and to really highlight how important they were. And as part of that, I even gave a voice to one of the people who would be around for her life, William Cecil, who basically got her through a lot of stuff in this book and who would go on to be her main advisor and Secretary of State for all her reign until his son took over the spot. So yes, this was truly a story about relationships.
And Gerry, I know I joked earlier that nothing survives the apocalypse, but a couple of things. But I'm sure people's relationships do too, right?
We hope so. Haley starts the book fleeing. She's been accused of murder, but she needs somewhere not just to flee from, but to flee to. So she's going to flee for the impossible, the love of her life, her first love, which is important in book 2 and 3, her girlfriend back in Ireland. So that really helps shape her, that her love is back home, and there's no way to get there. The whole East Coast is a radioactive nightmare, and the climate change, the storms are going to destroy it. There's no way to cross the Atlantic Ocean, so it's impossible. And she doesn't know if Marley is still alive, but she's still going to try. And then in a series of flashbacks to how she met Marley and their relationship, it shows how Haley grew as a person before the apocalypse, and why she makes some of the decisions and how she makes some of the decisions going forward. And then as the friend character, she is in a community and meets this 11, 12-year-old girl who's just bothersome and full of questions. And Haley ends up having to protect her and keep her alive. But really, Addie, the friend, ends up saving Haley and really makes her care for someone, which she hasn't really done so much since the world ended. So she's got to care for her friend now at the end of the world.
So one of the things that shows these relationships is going to be the dialogue between characters, right? So, Scott, I'll start with you. Talk a little bit about how you use dialogue, not only in building relationships between your characters, but also just defining who the characters are.
Well, in order to make believable characters, a believable dialogue, you need to know who your character is and where they came from. So you start with like who their parents were, how they were raised, how much education did they have. That's all going to have an effect. But then you're also going to have who they've been hanging out with most of their life, plus recently, plus whoever influenced how they said. Also, what their attitudes are, so that you're going to know in any given situation that if somebody says X, they're going to say Y in response to that. And I want to give you guys an example from just fiction in general. So if somebody walked up to your main character and said, I bet I could beat you into the dirt, how would they respond? It's going to change. On that boat going to shore on D-Day, one of my characters says, stow it, save it for the Krauts, because they already have a fight. You don't need another freaking fight right now. But if you're Jean-Luc Picard of the Star Trek Enterprise, you're going to need to say, you may test that assumption at your earliest convenience. Because that's how he talks. And if you're Doc Holliday, you're going to say, I'll be your Huckleberry. Because he's a folksy character, and that's the kind of people that he hung out with. He's a doctor, but he still has this people that he hangs out with, and it affects who he is. Now, for my main character, Tom, he is always on a mission. He is a military-minded human being that was planning to go into the military even before there was a war to go in the military for, because that's just his family tradition. So at all times, even when he's in the middle of an emotional outpouring to another character or dealing with his dad and the lost relationship he had with him in his life, he still has a certain amount of military bearing on him. And then you have David, who is a Jewish boy who smuggled out of Germany at the last minute just in time to turn around and come back and attack Europe on D-Day. He is just full of anger. So he is angry at his mom because she sent him away and he didn't understand it when he was a kid and he never worked through that. And he's angry because he grew up in New York, and New York in the 1930s, there's going to be some anger. So those things influence who they are and how they talk. And I also went and researched 1940s slang so that when I did this, they'd be talking like people from the 1940s. And I limited which slang they use based on stuff that would be familiar to you today. Like, I'm feeding you a line. Somebody's feeding you a line, you know they're lying to you. So, but I'm not going to, use anything that was completely alien to me when I was reading it, so that, I understand. Everybody understands what I'm saying. And I just want to touch on one other thing. I know I'm kind of answering this for long. If you really want to know about how your personal experiences affect how you talk, read the autobiography of Malcolm X, because he actually does a self-assessment. When he was a kid, he wanted to be a lawyer, and he's told he can't be that because he's a black boy. So he ended up becoming a criminal instead. And then later he became a religious and political leader, and his lexicon, by his own admission, changed over that time. And at one point it was down to just 400 words that he used on a regular basis based on his own assessment. And I'll leave it at that.
Why don't you hand the mic over to Anne? And Anne, why don't you tackle this too, dialogue?
Well, I am a very intuitive audio writer. And so, like I said, these people are talking to me. They all sound very different. Maddie Wilcox who is the old Los Angeles 1870s, she's a woman. She sounds very, very different from Lisa Wycherley in the 1980s, who's the nice girl and eventually not so nice. And Jannie Miller, who's a contemporary. She does not sound anything like any of these people to me. So I go with that, and apparently it seems to work.
That's great. So we have relationships defining characters, we have dialogue defining characters, and then we have physical characteristics that can define characters. So rather than just having the character looking at themselves in a mirror and giving a monologue on exactly what they look like, how do you approach that? And I'll start with Rie for this one.
Yeah, so I've been trying to find exactly where I put it. I don't remember. It's never gonna happen. I need to just do meditative this. But there's like two sections of this, because I have an extremely diverse cast of characters, but I'm very particular about how I write what that is. I don't put a whole lot of labels on it, but then sometimes you just got it. Because of the context of this particular world, it's so futuristic that then the labels that we use to describe ourselves now are not going to be applicable at that point in the future. But my character is half Chinese, half Mexican. And the way that this world works is there's a lot of emphasis on eugenics. So they purposefully mate certain people so that they have a larger amount of genetic diversity. And so I'm sorry, this is a really dark book, y'all. But anyway, so there's a moment in the book where I mention that the main character, the matriarch character tells the main character, oh, well, there's not a whole lot of combinations of, when you're a child of the country of China and the country of Mexico or something like that. So that's like the way that I sort of shorthand it. But there's no real moment where it's a matter of her looking in the mirror. I don't think I ever actually describe what her face looks like. I think most of it is just personality. So a lot of it is sort of like how she moves. Like if she's got some sort of, there's not a whole lot of, she doesn't yell, she doesn't shout. She just tends to be, a little bit irritated, a little bit agitated, but not really outwardly expressing that so much. She's a very careful kind of person, and you can tell in terms of how she takes steps towards somebody, or if she's hesitant about something like that. But in terms of her physical appearance, I think it ends up being, one, there's like a certain number of uniforms that they wear in the society. So you'll get a glimpse of a couple of those. There's a mention of cream-colored robes, or there's a mention of this dress that she wears as part of her ceremonial outfit. And then also just that she has sort of glimpses of her own hair there, here and there, in terms of seeing dark hair on the sides of her face. And then there's sort of mentions that her skin might be lighter or darker than somebody else's, not just sort of light in a vacuum or dark in a vacuum, but compared to my friends, mine is darker, hers is lighter, whatever it is. And I think the comparison of it tends to be the sweet spot in terms of talking about physical description without looking in the mirror and without putting specific physical descriptors that are current day labels on that.
Yeah, so that's cool. So it sounds like really character appearance is part of your world building, really, setting the context for the world. Marcy, we'll go to you on this now.
I have to try to describe their appearances either in an action, like the breeze ruffled his tousled dark hair, or in someone else's point of view as they're looking at them and thinking about the other person. He loved the intense look in her hazel eyes when she concentrated. So it's like a mirror, but not. Or if there's a need to describe their attire for whatever reason, the deep burgundy of the brocade fabric brought out the ruddiness in her cheeks, things like that. I pepper it in. I don't ever do a full, here's what my character looks like kind of a deal. Because I also think that as a reader, I don't necessarily envision exactly what, we all as readers see what we see in our heads, and then if something is brought into clearer focus, sometimes it doesn't jive with what you have in your mind, So I try to leave it in little bits like that, little breadcrumbs of appearance through those sorts of emotions. Unless it's something very specific, like we need to know exactly like how horrible a monster looks or something like that, you know what I mean? Just to drive terror into the characters' like thoughts.
Yeah, so like partially world building, but also if it needs to drive the plot of the book,
Yeah.
you have to have it there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anne, what about you?
Since a lot of my books are first person, I don't necessarily describe my characters. Lisa, you never see what she looks like. Now, she will talk about what Sid looks like. We all know he's average, about 3 inches taller than her, and she's average. And dark wavy hair and a cleft in his chin and bright blue eyes. That's throughout. But maybe she seldom mentions, she almost never mentions what she looks like. Maddie Wilcox. Again, Victorian lady. The only thing we know about her is she really has made a great effort to keep her skin white in the Los Angeles sun. This is set in the 1870s in LA. And she's gone to great trouble to keep her skin white, but that's all we know about her. So I will pepper it through periodically, or I will set up very shorthand. Again, it's always going to be big, 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 big. But I don't, if I'm doing third person, I'm more likely to just do the full description. But especially when I'm doing first person, you very rarely see the narrative.
Okay, I think we have time for like one more question. And it's going to be a speed round here. But so, for building a character, right, we've got the world we built, we've got what they look like, what they sound like. Now, what is their name? Now, in sci-fi and fantasy, sometimes, right, it just feels like a cat walked across the keyboard and that's the name of the character. But there's more thought put into it usually from an author. So, Vance, you've got the mic. Let's start with you.
Yeah, my science fiction story is set in the near future, so I was not as interested in bizarre human names. But I have my characters that are virtual humans. Well, what you find is computer people, anything that they're going to run multiple times, they try to make it a very short thing to type. So my characters have 3-letter names derived from Eleanor's human name. So my protagonist is E-L-E, pronounced Ellie, and the other version of her is L-N-X, pronounced Ellen X, because there are multiple versions of her that they try to create. So that was my approach.
That's cool. Marcy, fantasy writer. How do you come up with names?
Surprisingly not the keyboard cat method, although that does happen because cats. Sometimes the name of a character just like comes to me and I just know it inherently. The book I'm currently writing, I knew my main character's name is Lily Cleary. I just knew, like, it's like she's telling me her story and I'm just telling her story. Other times, like when I first wrote Archwild, I was a teenager. I had a room covered in posters, so I'd be like, well, I need a last name for my bad guy. And I'm looking around the room and I see a bunch of Tor fantasy books on my shelf, and I'm like, I'll just throw an extra R on the end of that. Tor, T-O-R-R. That's how Azor Tor got his last name. Or the neighboring country to Azran is the main country in my story, but the neighboring country is Kazdar. I had Star Wars posters all over my room. It was originally Kazdan, because Lord Kazdan and Empire Strikes Back was right on my thing. So I thought, well, I'll just change the last letter of it to R. So I guess if you just need a name, just change a letter in a word to R. And that seems to work for me.
That's a hot tip. Everybody write that down. Change the letter to R. Also sounds like you have some voices going on telling you these things, like Anne was saying earlier.
Yeah, I do channel stories sometimes.
Yeah. Gerry, where do you get your names?
A lot of names, once I hear the name, I know that's my character. But some of them are kind of jokes that are only funny in my head. I've got a character, Bosco, who's an aging ex-boxer, but he's named after an Irish kids TV show about a guy called, a puppet called Bosco who lives in a box. So he's a boxer. And my post-apocalyptic, started with a guy on a motorcycle, Harley. When I changed to a girl, it became Haley. And I've always loved the title, Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man, which is a movie I've never seen, but I love the title. So Haley Davidson and that Marley girl became my whole working title. It's so bad. Everyone else is Google. Like if they're 17, I figure out how old they are. If you're 17, you were born 2008. If you're 62, you were born 1963. So just go to Google, top 100 baby names 1963. And usually within the first 20 names, I just go, that's it, that's my character. It jibes with me, and that's where I get my name. And if you're in the top 20 names, it becomes an easy name, because I hate having the cat crawl across the keyboard and there's no vowels in there, and I'm reading a novel and I can't pronounce it in my head. So I like names that people know.
And you have a room full of people who will not admit to having seen Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man, I think.
I've never seen it, I must
I've heard of it too. All right, we're going to go down and we'll go to you next.
Okay. Again, 90% of the time the characters tell me their names. Sometimes if it's a minor character and I get stumped, depending on what I'm working on, I will sometimes baby names of. I've done that. I've done the looking around the room using the poster, but this is a book that will probably never see the light of day, but for one, at the time I was writing it, I was working in a shoe department, and I used the model names of the shoes for some of the characters. That may be why I'll never see the light of day.
Yeah, how do you come up with things, Janet?
My names I'm stuck with. These are set. And the problem is you know, all of these people would go, oh, that's fantastic. No, it's not, because they were all the same.
Yeah.
Okay? Everybody was named Elizabeth or Catherine or Mary
Or Anne.
Oh, also a big one. And so my problem is how you keep these names straight in the reader's minds. And I've had to work really hard on that. So Catherine was easy because I could do, because I only had 3 that I needed to do. Catherine with a C, Catherine with a K, Kathy, boom. For the others, I started having to change their names and explain it in the author's note. So, you know, there are just certain characters that are referred to over and over again. You can't keep them straight. So I had Missy and Mimi, and then for Elizabeth, and Lisa, Liza, Beth, and that was the way that when the reader encountered them, they knew exactly who it was, as opposed to trying to just situate. A secondary problem with my characters is that as people got rewarded, they got new titles, and you're known by your titles, so your name changed, often multiple times, and that could also happen, you know, if you're the Earl of Sussex and your father dies, then all of a sudden that name refers to a different person, and how do you deal with that? So one thing that happens in, pretty much it's happened in every single one of my books, is that somebody calls somebody, you know, first I explain the name change, you know, this is what happened, and then a couple of scenes later, the next time that character appears, you have somebody referring to them by their old name and going, oh, no, sorry, and correcting themselves, so that the reader can feel corrected there, and that I found helps. So, again, no any of you complain.
And on that note, I think I'm going to end this. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists today.
Thank you so much for joining. We're almost right at time, so I think I've got like 2 minutes maybe, but I wanted to do a little Q&A. So does anybody have a question? You first.
Do you have any advice for dealing with rejection, particularly when a family member said, you could never be a writer? Yeah.
Ignore them, but also,
Yeah.
so my spouse has never read this book. I've been working on it for, I don't even know, 15 years or something. He's never read it. And partially it's because he kept telling me that stuff in like grocery stores, not that particular, but he would like be critical of it. And I'd be just like, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. Blah, 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 blah. So don't let them read it. That's my advice. Also, for agents and things like that, just send your stuff out. The faster you get the rejections back, the easier it gets.
I beg to differ on that last point. But you do get over it. And rejection's never easy. It sucks. But you will, it doesn't get easier, but it does, you get more used to it. You go cry, scream, I'll never write again, I'm a horrible person, yada, yada, yada. And then you get back and say, okay, fine, let's go do the next one. These idiots don't know what they're talking about.
There's also another factor in that is that a lot of time rejection isn't necessarily about the quality of your writing or whether or not you're a good writer. It could just be about the volume of things people have to read, or a lot of times, like I've edited on anthologies before where we get like 200 submissions, but we can only take on 20 stories, you know? Like 99% of the stories could be great, but not all of them are gonna fit. So it doesn't necessarily mean rejection is personal, it just could be a logistical thing in some cases.
And it's also about your audience. Okay, so my relatives, nobody gives a crap about the tutors. They don't, but there are a lot of people out there that are fascinated by the tutors. So I actually did a lot of stuff, and I didn't tell a lot of the people that I knew that I was writing the stuff and that I was doing all of that, and I found my audience, and that's really what you need to do. And that is.
But yeah, don't be afraid to cry and scream though. You really do need to just have that time saying, oh damn, that hurt. Because it does.
Yeah.
You know, and then you say, okay, I'm bigger than this. And by the way, I'm smarter than this, and I'm a better writer than people think I am. So
There's crying during the writing process, there's crying during the rejection, there's crying when you don't get rejected. There's a lot of crying being a writer.
But there's no crying in baseball.
There's no crying in baseball. We have time for one more question.
My question for all of you is, when you run into these unique problems where you're writing, just like you just described, I have these names and okay, I have this unique problem. Where do you go, what resources do you turn to solve these unique problems in your writing?
Depends on the problem. Community really helps. If you can find other writers and writing groups, I mean, or like pretty much any of the people here. You know, and I'm not just even talking about the panel. Talk about it with your friends. Talk about it with the other writers that you know, because everybody does go through a lot of the same problems.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, but in addition, what I do is I put the question in my mind just before I go to sleep, every night. And after a day or two, ideas come. They're not always great ideas, but there are at least ideas.
Kind of to get the wheel turning.
Right. And I have a unique problem in that the time I'm writing about, there were black people in Los Angeles, there were Chinese, and there was rampant racism, casually. There was a street in Los Angeles that was the N-word alley, and that was commonly used, it's even on a few maps. That's how blatant the racism was at the time. And I'm not writing for that audience, so I also find sensitivity readers. Make sure that I am portraying people with the appropriate dignity, with, you know, and my character, of course, is not going to be that way, but there are, you know, it's really tough trying to write about an era when that was so accepted, and it's still not right, and it wasn't right then either. But how do you do it? So you have to, I have to go to the people who are the people of color. And I'm sorry, but I have to, because that's how I find out whether or not I have to be true to what's going on, because we're not going to get past this nonsense if we're not. But at the same time, how do I handle it in a way that's sensitive to the people who are living now?
All right, I think that's probably all the time we have for Q&A, but we're all going to hang out in front of our books over here afterwards, so feel free to come up to any of the authors, talk to them, ask them questions, maybe check out a book or two, and thank you all for coming. We really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thanks.